Hello, this is Dr. Llewellyn, and this is the last of our lectures on religion and late antiquity for this section, and this lecture will be on Greek and Roman religion. So, as you know, religion in antiquity was largely regional, and so when we look at the extent of the Roman Empire, if we're looking at this map here, the burgundy sections are what the Roman Empire looked like in the first century. Okay, still had a little bit more to go in terms of, conquering territory. But nevertheless, this is probably 3/4 of it. Religion was accommodated by the Romans as long as aspects of fidelity were adhered to. All right. So you have regional expressions of religious activity that are largely linked with people's language, with their ethnicity, and then, of course, with their geography. So we know that in the area known as Persia, modern-day Iran, the religion that was practiced by most individuals in that region was Zoroastrianism. I've already met the Zoroastrians. We know that in Palestine, the religion practiced by the Jews was that of the Israelites, the Hebrew people, known today as Judaism. And of course, Jews who were part of the diaspora continue to practice their religion, whether they're in Alexandria or in Tripoli or Thebes or Rome. Among the Greeks and the Romans and many in North Africa, especially of Latin descent, religion was represented largely by religions of the family and consisted of cult activity that was based on their fidelity to a specific divine being. And that's a bit about what we're going to unpack today. But in addition, of course, you also have indigenous religious activity of those in Arabia, and you also have indigenous religious activity of those in tribes in Northern Europe, and among the Celts farther north than North Europe. So a few things about religion in antiquity among the Greeks and the Romans. It was not a question of there simply being monotheism or polytheism. Okay, so monotheism, as we know, is mono, single, theism, divinity, or God, as it's often interpreted. So someone who's monotheist, right here, monotheist, is someone who adheres to the worship of one god or goddess. But here's the thing about monotheism. Just because someone's a monotheist doesn't mean they don't believe that other gods or goddesses exist. And so one might very well be a monotheist, like a practitioner of Judaism, but that doesn't mean that they don't think that other gods and goddesses exist. So keep this in mind when we think about Christianity emerging within a world in which there is a religious marketplace. So some of the ways of being religious in antiquity include, in addition to monotheism, henotheism, for example, which is an adherence to a divine being that is affiliated with a particular family or a particular tribe. And in that case, henotheists don't dispute the existence of other gods and goddesses. They just adhere to the veneration of their own. Or one might be a ditheist. And ditheists were those who believed that there was one God who may very well express itself in multiple ways. So very often broken into sort of a good version of the God and an evil version of the God, which is kind of connected to this one down here, Maltheism. And, you see the word theism, right? So divine being, and mal, if someone has malice, right? So a maltheist was one who believed that divine beings existed, but they were probably evil, right? Sort of the why did God let this happen to me kind of thinking. And then, of course, there's others of which you're probably very well familiar. Polytheism, pantheism, the belief that nature is divine, or panentheism, the belief that that not that nature is divine, but that the divine can exist within nature. All right, so subtle difference, but a difference nevertheless. And of course, the well-known atheist. And atheism in antiquity didn't mean the same thing that it means today. Generally today, atheists get a terrible reputation as very often being opposed to religion, when actually atheism just simply means without the divine or without a god. And atheists in antiquity were generally just people who were seen as not adhering to the principles of the worship of a group's divine beings. Worse than atheism in antiquity was actually superstition, because superstition operates under the belief that if you don't perform certain actions, the world or fate or a divine being will hurt you. And this was seen as very capricious and problematic by people. So it was actually better to be considered an atheist than considered superstitious. But religion in antiquity, for all of this diversity, for all of this huge marketplace, it did have some common features, which I'm trying to bring up here. There we go. Religion in antiquity was shaped around loyalty. It was shaped around fidelity and patronage. And, of course, knowing what we know about the social values of this world, this should come as absolutely no surprise, right? That you would be expected to be, there's the word fides, faithful, loyal, okay, devoted to the divine beings of those who were in charge of you, those who were your patron. Now, in addition to religion being shaped around loyalty, fidelity, and patronage, it was also culturally and ethnically conditioned. So there were, of course, expectations, because we know how important kinship was, that you would be faithful, okay? You would show fidelity to your own particular culture and your ethnic group, okay? Here's where we get like henotheism, all right? Fidelity to the divine being of one's community. And then finally, and perhaps most interesting, religion in antiquity was absolutely integral to everyday activities. Religion wasn't a thing that you did, it was who you were. Religion, remember, is a modern term that we place over a group of people that do certain things and think certain things. And in antiquity, you engaged in rituals and you engaged in behaviors and you demonstrated fidelity because it was simply what you did, right? It was simply who you were. It was not something that you only did once a week. It was something that was just a natural part of who you are. It was a ritual that was as integral to who you were as, say, brushing your teeth or putting on shoes before you go outside. You don't think about it. You don't think, it's time to put on my shoes now. You just do it. And religion in antiquity functioned in that way. You engaged in these behaviors because it was central to your life. All right? So approaches to the divine happened really in antiquity in three different fields. So I want to address them briefly before we move forward. So a lot of times people, when they find out I teach religion in antiquity, and I do teach Greco-Roman religion, which isn't our class, but nevertheless is a little bit of it. A lot of times people say, oh, I love those myths. I want to read all about Greek and Roman religion and read about the gods and goddesses. And the truth is that's not really Greek and Roman religion. I mean, those gods and goddesses are there, right? But that's literature, right? So you're going to find Zeus and Juno and Jupiter and Hera and Juno and Athena, Minerva, and all of these figures, Dionysius, Bacchus, however you call them by Greek or Latin name. You're going to find all of these figures, right? But you're not going to find them in Greek and Roman religion, okay? You're going to find them in the literature and the art. And so that really is the language of poetry. That's what the poets and the historians, believe it or not, are writing about. They're writing about those figures, all right? So one approach to the divine in antiquity was through this medium of literature and visuals, okay? A second approach to the divine was through that of the philosophers. And the philosophers really rejected a lot of the stories about divine beings. Their argument was, these are disgusting creatures of whom you are writing, and divine beings don't function that way. On the other hand, we can access something of the divine through the physical. We will act in such a way, we will engage in ethical behaviors such that we demonstrate what the divine is really like. So it's interesting because when you look at how what Christianity is going to become, there is a much clearer line between Christianity and the philosophers than there is between Christianity and any kind of priests or religious texts, which you don't really have in antiquity. And then finally, an approach to the divine is seen through the cult. And that's where the greater population is engaging in what we would call religious rituals, okay? And we're going to talk about that a bit more here as we go along. But in short, there is public practices of the cult, and there are private actions of the cults. And we're going to break those down here, which is actually our next task, because in fact, the most significant approach to the divine is the fact that among the activity of the cult, what we call religious activity is taking place in both the public realm and in the private realm, and they're informing each other, okay? So the public realm is where you demonstrate fides to the state, and because you do what you do in the public, you're allowed to do what you want to do in private, okay? And I'll say that again so that it makes more sense if that didn't make sense to you, but it will by the end of this lecture, I promise. So it's fair to say that in the Roman world, in late antiquity, religion didn't conform to our understanding of what constitutes religion, right? So when we think of religion, we think a group of people who are reading a text or getting together once a week. They have someone who's in charge, and they do rituals that maybe to someone outside of that context doesn't make any sense, right? Oh, and they have expectations about behavior, you know, what you're supposed to do and when, and how you're supposed to dress. So those are sort of standard tropes of religion in our world. In antiquity, they had none of that, okay? There were no sacred scriptures among Greek and Roman religions. There was no priestly class. There was no religiously motivated moral code, which is why it didn't matter what the gods and goddesses did, okay? Because, you know, your sexual behavior wasn't an indication of how religious you were or were not, all right? And there were no doctrinal systems. There were no sort of theological constructions of what you had to believe or not believe, all right? But Romans did have assumptions about behavior, all right? And they exerted pressure when it didn't conform. So, for example, you're looking here at a fresco of the rites of Bacchus, a bacchanalia, right? So people engaging in behavior that was seen as rather unseemly. Here we have some women engaging in religious rituals. This woman here, okay, who is bent over the lap of this attendant is being beaten, actually, as part of a religious ritual to gain entry into a cult. And here we have a frieze of some women engaging in dancing during the course of a Bacchanalian or Dionysian event, okay? And so the Romans had a problem with any kind of religious behavior like these rituals that did not conform to their social values. So women dancing in an ecstatic fashion, people being beaten, drunkenness, things like this. This was a problem for Romans. And so they made exceptions to the incorporation of other worlds' religions into their pantheon as long as they could control it. So, as Josephus Flavius, who is the author of Antiquities of the Jews, writes, accordingly, when I forbid other bacchanal rioters, okay, so this is Caesar speaking, I permit these Jews to gather together according to the customs and laws of their forefathers and to persist therein. So, it's a reminder that the Romans were concerned about not just granting favors to the Jews to engage in their customs and laws, as we saw in the last session, but here we want to emphasize the earlier part of that statement, right? Which is, I forbid other rioters. Okay, so there are some who are allowed to gather together and do what they do, and there are others who are not. Okay, so the Romans did have expectations about the way you had to behave. They admired the Jews for their ethical code, which they themselves believed they held as in a high of an importance as the Jews. So let's talk a little bit about public religion. Public religion in Rome consisted of mostly festivals and celebrations and honoring and showing fidelity to the state. Okay, so for example, here we have Marcus Aurelius, who is engaged, he's dressed as a priest, and he is sacrificing this bull right here, which is a symbol of fertility and wealth. And he's functioning as the high priest of the city and empire of Rome in thanks for, battles that he's won, successes that he has had. And so gathering together during these moments of public celebration were really important. Honoring the calendar of divinities and divine beings, showing fidelity to that which Rome honored was a way of ensuring that you could then engage in private religious activity without any concern of that being hindered. Other ways of demonstrating fidelity to the public religion was through recognition of the importance of the goddess Roma, who oversaw the protection of the city. She still stands there, or sits there, more accurately. You can go and visit her in the forum. And here she is on the coin. And so every time you engaged in a transaction, you were holding a coin that would have someone's head. Remember, this is the chronological origin story. Here you have an actual historical figure, but then also you have the divine being on the other side. So this public expression of both the reality of Rome and also the mythic origins and the importance of the divine favor were essential to Roman identity, and adherence to this and fidelity to this meant that you could then go home and do whatever it is that that you needed to do. There were two other types of public religion that we should touch on. One is that of the Vestal Virgins. You have already been introduced to them. If we were, here's the forum, here's the Roman forum, and if we were in Caesar's palace right here, or Octavian's palace, we'd be looking down, and right at the base of the palace is the Temple of the Vestals. And this was the hearth that they tended, where all Roman citizens would come and they would gather fire for their homes to keep themselves warm. This temple really functioned as the heartbeat of the city, because you have to have fire in order to cook your meals and keep warm and survive. Here we have, this is a close-up of one of these. I think it's this woman here. one of these statues of a prominent Vestal. And you'll be reading for this lesson a little bit about the Vestals and what happened if they betrayed their oath or their code. And then perhaps the most well-known of the public religions in antiquity is the cult of the emperor. Of course, we see this in the titles more than anything. Here we have Julius Caesar, who was known as Divus Julius. And then we have his adopted nephew, Octavian, who was known as Divi Filius. So here we have the divine Julius, and here we have the divine son. So the god and the son of the god. Okay, so it's important to recognize that Octavian, who was the emperor during the years of Jesus' youth, was known as the Son of God during a time of Jesus' lifetime. And so the phrase Son of God, okay, is certainly going to be one that is a familiar term during the lifetime of the writers of the gospel accounts, who will refer to Jesus as the Son of God. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about private religion, all right? And private religion was, as you know, it was something that was private, and it was something that was very much connected with the family, with the community, and as long as you were faithful to, as long as you demonstrated fides to the concerns of the state, you were fairly free to engage in whatever cult behavior caught your fancy or need. And you've heard me use the word cult now several times, and if we were in class together, probably someone would stop me and say, I thought cults were bad things. Cults got a bad reputation in the 70s when we had all these strange cults, the Jim Jones, and later in the 90s you have Waco, and there was a lot of cult activity in the 70s and 80s, and during times of crisis, people turn towards extreme ways of thinking about things. And a cult is simply, as I defined it here for you, a system of veneration to a figure, an idea, or a group. And so basically any club is a cult. Any religious system is a cult because they are systems of veneration to an idea, to a figure, or a group. So it's very important that you understand the word cult the way I'm using it. Okay? When I say cult, I'm not saying this is a bad fake thing. Okay? Cult means a system of veneration to a figure, idea, or group. So let's take a look at some examples of voluntary or private groups. So, oh, and there's my dog. Sorry, gotta go answer the door. All right, so as I've written along the bottom of these different types of reasons why people might seek out private cult activity, for the most part, people sought traditional benefits through various cult activities. Probably the best example is, of course, people sought healing and healthcare at the cult of Asclepius or Hygeia. And, these were not competitive in the way religions and groups are today. You could go to the Temple of Asclepius, and if you did not receive healing, it was perfectly fine to go to the cult of or the Temple of Apollo, and you might receive healing there, right? So it wasn't competitive the way we often think about groups trying to gain adherence and gain numbers. People would consult oracles, or they would go to shrines to gain insight. Maybe they want information about love or marriage or a child or death or a job or something. People would engage in cult activity for the sake of competition, or for desire, for love spells, or for out of loneliness, right? Or maybe somebody was obsessed with them and they didn't want them to be, or the opposite. Additional types of, why isn't this going? Come on. Additional private cults would provide different kinds of needs. They would address needs that people had around things like salvation, like the cult of Mithra, which was one of the cults that was, it's a Roman religion that is based on Zoroastrian principles, and so it has a divinely born savior that offers an opportunity for an eternal life. And that was actually a religion that was competitive with Christianity. And so for people who sought life or an existence beyond this one, that would be a cult that would be particularly attractive. The cult of Isis had similar salvific kinds of theologies, and especially one with a strong relationship between the divine figure of Isis and her followers. Or somebody might have need of fertility, so they might be a practitioner at the cult of Sybil. Or maybe somebody sought revenge, right? Sometimes our needs are more base than others. And so these are all sort of, traditional ways that people seek relationship with divine beings for money, for jobs, for information, for hope, for love, for children, or revenge, I guess. So these were some of the examples of types of private cult activity in which people would engage. And, in Rome, it was fine. It was fine to make these choices. People made choices based on what they wanted or what they needed. 3 general truths, really, about Greek and Roman ancestral religion that we can kind of sum up with here is that whether you access the divine through cult activity, through literature, through history, through ethical behavior, irrespective of that, the divine was understood as something that was real. It was understood as a real thing. Second, a second general truth is that a person's lifetime was understood as a combination of divine activity and the challenges of fate, right? That one could appeal to a divine being, a goddess or a god, for intervention. But at the end of the day, if that was not your fate, that divine being might have very little to do with the intended outcome. And then the final general truth about ancestral religion, Greek and Roman religion, is that it was very much shaped by your social location. You might be a citizen of the Roman Empire, but if you're living in North Africa, you are likely to be an adherent of Sybil. You could be living in the Roman Empire, but located in Egypt, and you were more likely to be active in the cult of Isis than you would necessarily be concerned with what's happening in the Roman pantheon. Okay, so even though you have this Roman Empire, remember it's an empire, it's not a state. Okay, it's a massive formation of people of different ethnicities, using different languages, and so this of course is going to inform their religious practices. So what historical questions do you have about Greco-Roman religion that I did not answer? Feel free to write them down, and I look forward to hearing them when we have our next tutorial. Thank you.